The emergency room at Massachusetts General smelled like fear wrapped in disinfectant. Lila Brennan pushed through the swinging doors at full sprint, her scrubs still damp from an October rain that had soaked through her jacket during the mad dash from the parking garage. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a mechanical indifference that made the chaos below feel even more surreal. Gurneys lined the hallway. A child screamed somewhere behind curtain 3. The attending physician's voice crackled over the intercom, calling for assistance in Trauma Bay 2. None of it mattered. Lila's mother was dying, and the world had narrowed to that single, unbearable fact. A nurse Lila didn't recognize grabbed her elbow as she tried to push past the registration desk. The woman's voice carried that professional gentleness reserved for people receiving the worst news of their lives. "Family waits in the..." Lila shook her off. "I'm ICU. I know the protocol."
"Where is she?"
The nurse's expression shifted, recognition dawning. "Bay 7. Dr. Ashford's team is with her now." The name meant nothing. Lila had worked the ICU for 4 years, knew most of the attending physicians by reputation, if not by face. But Dr. Ashford was unfamiliar. Probably new. Probably young and ambitious and too focused on charts to remember that every code blue represented someone's entire world collapsing. She found Bay 7 by following the sound of controlled chaos. A crash cart stood abandoned just outside the curtain. Inside, 5 people moved with the choreographed precision of a team that had done this dance too many times to count. At the center of it all, a man in a white coat stood with his back to the door, calling out orders in a voice that cut through the noise like a scalpel through skin. "Epi, 1 milligram, now! And someone get me a clear airway. I don't care how, just make it happen." The voice carried no warmth, no reassurance, only absolute certainty. Lila watched as the team responded without hesitation, hands moving in perfect synchronization. The monitor beside the bed showed a heart rhythm that made Lila's stomach drop. V-fib. Her mother's heart was quivering uselessly in her chest, unable to pump blood to the organs that needed it. Lila had seen this before, had participated in dozens of codes during her years in the ICU. But watching from outside the curtain, powerless to do anything but observe, was an entirely different kind of torture. The man in the white coat, Dr. Ashford, she assumed, reached for the defibrillator paddles. "Clear!" Her mother's body jerked against the restraints. The monitor flatlined for one endless second before a rhythm reappeared. Not perfect, but stable enough to buy time. Dr. Ashford stepped back, stripping off his gloves with practiced efficiency. Only then did he turn toward the door, and Lila got her first clear look at the man who had just saved her mother's life. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair that looked like it had been combed with his fingers during a hurried morning routine. Steel blue eyes scanned the bay with clinical detachment, cataloging details the way other people cataloged grocery lists. His face was all sharp angles and aristocratic bones, the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers advertising expensive watches or Italian suits. He looked at Lila the way he might look at a piece of equipment left in the wrong place. "Family waits outside during medical procedures." No introduction, no acknowledgement that he'd just pulled someone back from the edge of death, just cold, efficient dismissal. Lila opened her mouth to respond, but one of the nurses, Jenny Chen, who'd trained Lila during her first month in the ICU, touched her arm gently. "Come on, honey. Let them work." Dr. Ashford had already turned away, barking orders about medications and imaging protocols. Lila let Jenny guide her toward the family waiting room, a small space painted in colors meant to be soothing, but that only succeeded in looking depressing. Beige walls, gray chairs, a coffee machine that dispensed something vaguely resembling liquid tar. Jenny squeezed her hand before heading back to the chaos. "Your mom's in good hands. Dr. Ashford is the best cardiac surgeon we have." The words should have been comforting. Instead, they settled in Lila's chest like stones. She sank into one of the gray chairs and waited. Time moved differently in hospital waiting rooms. Minutes stretched into hours, hours compressed into moments. Lila watched the rain streak down the window overlooking the ambulance bay, each drop racing the others toward some invisible finish line. She thought about calling her grandmother, but couldn't bring herself to pick up the phone. Not yet. Not until she knew what she was going to say. When Dr. Porter finally appeared in the doorway, Lila's throat tightened. Andrew Porter was everything Dr. Ashford wasn't. Warm, empathetic, the kind of doctor who remembered patient names and asked about their grandchildren. He'd been on staff at Mass General for 20 years, and everyone loved him, which was why Lila knew immediately that the news wasn't good. Dr. Porter sat down beside her, his movements careful, deliberate. Your mother is stable, for now. Dr. Ashford managed to restore normal rhythm, and we've moved her to the ICU for monitoring. Lila waited for the other shoe to drop. There was always another shoe. But Dr. Porter's expression shifted into something that looked like pity, and Lila hated it. The echocardiogram shows advanced heart failure. Her ejection fraction is down to 20%. At this stage, we're looking at two options: a transplant, which could take years given the waiting list, or an experimental surgical procedure that might buy her more time. The words landed with the weight of a death sentence. Lila had seen enough heart failure cases to know what 20% ejection fraction meant. Her mother's heart was failing, dying, and there was nothing Lila could do to stop it. What's the experimental procedure? Dr. Porter pulled out a tablet, swiping through images that meant nothing to Lila's increasingly frantic mind. It's a new technique developed by Dr. Ashford's team. They've had promising results in early trials, but it's expensive. Very expensive, and not covered by most insurance plans. Of course it wasn't covered. Nothing good ever was. Lila's voice came out steadier than she felt. How expensive? $350,000. The number hung in the air between them, impossible and immovable. Lila made $62,000 a year. She had student loans from nursing school that would take another decade to pay off. Her father's cancer treatment 2 years ago had depleted what little savings the family had managed to scrape together. Her grandmother lived on a fixed income that barely covered rent and groceries. $350,000 might as well have been $350 million. Dr. Porter reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. I know this is a lot to process. Take some time. Talk to your family. We'll keep your mother comfortable while you figure out next steps. He left her alone in the waiting room with a decision that felt like choosing between impossible and unthinkable. Lila found her grandmother in the hospital chapel. Nora Brennan sat in the front pew, rosary beads threaded through fingers that had worked in factory assembly lines for 40 years before arthritis forced retirement. At 78, Nora's spine was still straight, her gaze still sharp, her faith still unshakable. She looked up when Mila entered, and the expression on her weathered face said she already knew why Lila had come. Your mother? Stable, for now. Lila slid into the pew beside her grandmother, breathing in the familiar scent of candle wax and old wood. They're saying she needs surgery. Experimental. Expensive. Nora's fingers stilled on the rosary beads. How expensive? More than we have. More than we could ever have. The silence that followed felt heavy with all the things they'd already lost. Lila's grandfather had died 15 years ago, leaving Nora with a pension that inflation had slowly eroded into near poverty. Lila's father had fought cancer for 2 brutal years before losing that battle, leaving behind medical bills that had forced them to sell the family home in Dorchester. They'd moved to a smaller place in South Boston, crammed 3 generations into a 2-bedroom row house that always smelled faintly of Irish soda bread and regret. They'd survived. Barely, but they'd survived. This felt like the universe asking for more than they had left to give. Nora reached over, covering Lila's hand with her own. The skin was thin, papery, marked with age spots and scars from a lifetime of hard work. But the grip was still strong. When God closes a door, He opens a window. Sometimes you just have to be brave enough to climb through. Lila wanted to believe that, wanted to have the kind of faith that sustained her grandmother through decades of struggle and loss. But right now, staring at an impossible decision, faith felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. What if there's no window this time? Nora's grip tightened. Then we make one. They sat together in the chapel until visiting hours ended. Lila went home to the cramped row house in South Boston, climbed into bed fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling until exhaustion finally dragged her under. She woke to her phone vibrating on the nightstand, an unknown number. Lila almost ignored it, but something made her answer. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, female. "Miss Brennan? This is Dr. Helena Ashford. I'm calling about your mother's case." Lila sat up, suddenly wide awake. "Is she okay? Did something happen?" "Your mother is stable. I'm not calling about her immediate condition. I'm calling because I have a proposal that might interest you." The word proposal sent warning signals firing through Lila's exhausted brain. Nothing good ever started with strangers offering proposals at 7 in the morning. "What kind of proposal?" "Not something I can discuss over the phone. Can you meet me at the hospital cafeteria in an hour?" Lila should have said no. Should have hung up and gone back to sleep and pretended this conversation had never happened. But desperation made people do irrational things. "I'll be there." The cafeteria at Massachusetts General occupied the ground floor, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the morning rush of Boston traffic. Lila found Dr. Helena Ashford sitting at a corner table, a cup of coffee cooling in front of her, untouched. Helena Ashford looked exactly like her son, all sharp angles and aristocratic bones, but where Callum's face carried cold detachment, Helena's held a different kind of calculation. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Lila's monthly rent, her platinum hair pulled back in a style that suggested both elegance and efficiency. She stood when Lila approached, extending a hand. "Miss Brennan, thank you for coming." Lila shook the offered hand, noting the strength in Helena's grip. This was a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted. They sat. Helena folded her hands on the table, her gaze direct and unflinching. "I'll be blunt because I suspect you appreciate directness. My son needs a wife, for professional reasons, and you need money to save your mother's life. I believe we can help each other." The words were so unexpected, so utterly absurd, that Lila almost laughed. "You want me to marry your son? A complete stranger?" "I want you to enter into a 1-year marriage contract with my son. At the end of that year, you'll receive a quiet annulment, and your mother will have received the surgical care she needs. All expenses covered." Lila stared at this elegant, composed woman who was proposing something that sounded like it belonged in a bad television drama. Why? Because the board of directors at Massachusetts General is run by old men with old-fashioned values. They believe the chief of cardiac surgery should be a family man. My son is brilliant, the best surgeon they have. But his personal life doesn't fit their narrow definition of stability. "So you're buying him a wife?" Helena's expression didn't change. "I'm offering a mutually beneficial arrangement. You save your mother, Callum gets the position he's worked toward his entire career. Everyone wins. Lila should have walked away. Should have told this woman that marriage wasn't a business transaction and that she'd find another way to save her mother. But the image of her mother's failing heart filled her mind, and she heard herself asking the question anyway. What would this arrangement entail? Helena pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. Inside were typed pages detailing terms and conditions that read like a corporate contract. Lila scanned the contents, her disbelief growing with each paragraph. Live in Callum's penthouse. Attend hospital events as his devoted wife. Maintain separate bedrooms. No emotional entanglement. 1 year. Then freedom. And at the bottom, a number that made Lila's breath catch. $350,000 for her mother's surgery, plus a $100,000 settlement when the arrangement ended. It was insane. Impossible. Wrong on every conceivable level. And it was the only option that didn't end with her mother dying. I need to think about it. Helena nodded, sliding a business card across the table. You have 24 hours. After that, we'll need to explore other options. Lila took the card, her fingers numb. She left the cafeteria in a daze, walking through the hospital corridors without seeing them. Her phone buzzed as she reached the parking garage. A text from Dr. Porter. Your mother's condition is deteriorating. We need to make a decision about treatment soon. The universe, it seemed, had very specific ideas about her timeline. She drove to the row house in South Boston, let herself in with shaking hands, and found her grandmother in the kitchen making tea. Nora took one look at Lila's face and set down the kettle. Tell me. So Lila told her. Everything. The proposal, the money, the impossible choice between her mother's life and her own dignity. She expected shock, maybe outrage, definitely some kind of lecture about the sanctity of marriage. Instead, Nora poured 2 cups of tea and sat down across from Lila with a thoughtful expression. This Dr. Ashford, you've met him? Briefly, he's... Lila searched for words that wouldn't sound cruel. Cold, arrogant, the kind of doctor who sees patients as problems to solve rather than people to care for. And his mother thinks you can fix that? I don't think she cares about fixing him. She just wants him to get the promotion. Nora sipped her tea, steam rising around her weathered face. You know what I think? That I'm insane for even considering this? I think you should meet him. Really meet him. Not as a nurse watching from outside a trauma bay, but as the woman who's being asked to share his life for a year. If you're going to do this, you should at least know what you're agreeing to. It was practical advice, sensible, exactly what Lila should have thought of herself. She called Helena's number. I want to meet him first, before I decide anything. Helena's response was immediate. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. His office on the 5th floor. Lila barely slept that night. She stood in front of her closet at 6 in the morning, trying to decide what one wore to meet the arrogant stranger one might marry for money. Professional seemed safest. She chose gray slacks and a blue blouse that matched her eyes, pulled her dark hair back in a neat bun, and forced herself to eat toast she couldn't taste. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur. Lila found the 5th floor, found Dr. Callum Ashford's office, and stood outside the door for a full minute before finally knocking. Come in. The voice was the same one she'd heard in the trauma bay. Cold, efficient, completely devoid of warmth. Lila pushed open the door and stepped into a space that looked more like a corporate boardroom than a doctor's office. Mahogany desk, medical journals arranged alphabetically on built-in shelves, a window overlooking the city, the morning light making everything look sharp and clinical. Dr. Callum Ashford sat behind the desk, not bothering to stand when she entered. He wore an expensive suit beneath his white coat, his dark hair perfectly styled, his steel blue eyes scanning her with the same clinical detachment he'd shown in the trauma bay. He gestured toward the chair across from him without preamble. "Sit. This won't take long." Lila sat, bristling at the dismissive tone. Up close, she could see the details she'd missed before. The way his jaw tightened when he was thinking, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the hands that had saved her mother's life, now folded on the desk with casual authority. He pulled out a piece of paper, typed, of course, and slid it across the desk. "My mother explained the arrangement?" "She explained that you need a wife for professional reasons, and I need money to save my mother." "Yes." If he heard the edge in her voice, he didn't acknowledge it. "Good. Then we can dispense with unnecessary explanations. Here are my requirements." Lila looked down at the paper. It was a list, numbered, like a grocery list or a surgical protocol. 1. No emotional attachment. This is a business arrangement. 2. Attend required hospital events and act the part of a devoted wife. 3. Separate living quarters within my home. 4. No interference with my schedule or professional obligations. 5. Appropriate behavior at all public functions. The last item made Lila's jaw tighten. Appropriate behavior? What does that mean? Callum leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanged. "It means you'll speak when spoken to. You'll smile when expected. You'll make polite conversation with board members and their wives without embarrassing me professionally." "Speak when spoken to?" Lila heard her voice rising and didn't care. "What century are you from?" "I value efficiency. Small talk is inefficient, but the board expects it, so you'll provide it." Lila stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "Thank you for your time, Dr. Ashford. I'll find another way." She was halfway to the door when his voice stopped her. "Your mother has 72 hours, maybe less. You don't have another way." Lila turned, fury and desperation warring in her chest. "Don't weaponize my mother's illness." Callum's expression didn't change. He simply stared at her with those cold blue eyes, stating facts without emotion. "I'm not weaponizing anything. I'm stating medical reality. Emotion doesn't change the prognosis. And compassion? Does that change anything? Or is that too inefficient for you?" For the first time, something flickered in Callum's eyes. Not warmth exactly, but something like surprise, as if no one had challenged him in years and he'd forgotten what it felt like. He stood, moving around the desk with controlled grace. Up close, he was taller than she'd expected, 6'2", maybe more. Lila refused to step back. "You're angry. I understand. But anger won't save your mother. This arrangement will. And treating me like property? That's part of the arrangement too? I'm offering you $450,000 and a year of comfortable living in exchange for attending a few social functions. Most people would consider that generous. Most people would consider it prostitution." The word hung between them, sharp and ugly. Callum's jaw tightened, the first real emotion she'd seen from him. "If you believe that, then leave. I won't stop you." Lila should have left. Should have walked out of that pristine office and found a way, any way, that didn't involve selling a year of her life to an arrogant stranger who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. But her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from the ICU. "Your mother's oxygen saturation dropping. Please call." The universe had made its position clear. Lila looked at Callum Ashford, this cold, efficient man who held her mother's life in his hands, and felt something harden in her chest. I have conditions too. One eyebrow lifted. Such as? You treat me with basic respect. Not as an employee, not as a prop, but as a business partner. Which is what this is, right? A business arrangement? Agreed. Anything else? I keep working. 3 shifts a week at the ICU. I'm not going to sit in your penthouse being decorative. Callum considered this, then nodded. As long as it doesn't interfere with required social obligations.
And you don't talk to me like I'm stupid. I'm an ICU nurse. I understand medicine probably better than half the board members you're trying to impress.
Something that might have been respect flickered across Callum's face. Fair enough. Do we have an agreement? Lila thought about her mother lying in the ICU, about her grandmother praying in the chapel, about all the choices that had led to this impossible moment. She thought about the life she'd imagined for herself, meeting someone, falling in love, building something real and true and lasting. This was none of those things. But it was a chance, maybe the only chance her mother had.
24 hours. I need to talk to my family first.
Callum returned to his desk, pulling out a business card and writing something on the back. My personal number. Call when you decide. Lila took the card, their fingers brushing for just a second. His hands were cold. She left the office and drove straight to the row house in South Boston. Her grandmother was in the kitchen, kneading dough for Irish soda bread. The familiar rhythm, press, fold, turn, press, had always been Nora's way of thinking through problems. Lila sat at the scarred kitchen table and told her everything. Nora kept kneading, her weathered hands working the dough with practiced ease. When Lila finished, her grandmother dusted flour from her fingers and turned to face her. You want my permission or my advice? Both. Nora sat down across from her, reaching for Lila's hands. Permission is easy. Do what you need to do to save your daughter. I'll support whatever choice you make. And the advice? Don't let him break your spirit. You're strong, Lila. Stronger than you know. This man thinks he can control everything with rules and requirements. Show him he's wrong. Be yourself. Challenge him. Make him remember that marriage, even a fake one, involves another human being, not a checklist. Lila felt tears prickling behind her eyes. What if I can't do it? What if I agree to this and then can't stand being around him? Nora squeezed her hands. Then you survive. One day at a time. You've survived worse. They sat together in silence, the smell of yeast and butter filling the small kitchen. Finally, Lila pulled out her phone and dialed the number on Callum's card. He answered on the first ring. Miss Brennan? I'll do it. On one condition. Which is? After the year is over, you make sure my mother gets follow-up care. Not just the surgery, but everything after. Medications, checkups, everything she needs. A pause, then, agreed. I'll have my attorney draw up the contract. We'll need to move quickly. The board meeting is in 2 weeks. 2 weeks? Lila's voice rose. You expect me to marry you in 2 weeks? Is there a reason to wait? This is a business arrangement, not a romance. The sooner we formalize it, the sooner your mother gets the care she needs. Efficient. Always efficient. Lila wanted to hate him for it, but he wasn't wrong. Fine. 2 weeks. She hung up before he could respond, before she could change her mind, before the reality of what she'd just agreed to could fully sink in. Nora was watching her with that steady, knowing gaze. You're sure? No, but I'm doing it anyway. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and preparation. Helena sent a car to take Lila to meetings with attorneys who explained prenuptial agreements in language that made her head spin. There were contracts to sign, medical forms to fill out, financial disclosures that revealed exactly how wealthy the Ashford family really was. Callum's trust fund alone was worth $600 million. The penthouse in Back Bay was valued at $15 million. He had investments in medical technology companies, real estate holdings across New England, and a foundation in his father's name that funded cardiac research. Lila had $17,000 in savings and a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a broken air conditioner. The disparity should have made her feel small. Instead, it made her angry. All that wealth, and he couldn't be bothered to show basic human kindness. She met with Callum twice more before the wedding, once to discuss logistics, when to move into the penthouse, what events required her attendance, how to handle questions from curious colleagues. The conversation was stilted, formal, like two strangers negotiating a ceasefire. The second meeting was 3 days before the wedding. Helena had arranged for a dress delivered to Lila's row house in a garment bag that probably cost more than Lila's entire wardrobe. It was beautiful. Simple white silk, elegant without being ostentatious. The kind of dress a woman might choose if she were actually getting married for love. Lila tried it on in her cramped bedroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She looked like a bride. She felt like an imposter. Her phone rang, Callum's name on the screen. Hello? The rehearsal is tomorrow at 3. Be on time. No greeting, no pleasantries, just instructions delivered in that same efficient tone. Something in Lila snapped. Dr. Ashford? A word of advice. When you're asking someone to pretend to be in love with you, try acting like you give a damn about them. It makes the performance more convincing. She hung up before he could respond, her heart pounding with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. Helena called 10 minutes later. What did you say to my son? I told him to try acting human. Was I wrong? A pause. Then, to Lila's surprise, Helena laughed. No, you weren't wrong. He needs someone who'll stand up to him. God knows no one else does. Her voice softened slightly. This isn't easy for him either, you know. Callum doesn't let people in. Hasn't since his father died. This arrangement requires him to pretend vulnerability he doesn't actually possess. Then maybe he shouldn't have agreed to it. Maybe, but he did. And now you both have to make it work. The rehearsal the next day was a disaster. The chapel behind the hospital was small, cold, and utterly devoid of anything resembling warmth. The officiant was a nervous young minister who kept glancing at Callum as if expecting to be corrected. Helena sat in the front pew, observing everything with her sharp, calculating gaze. Callum arrived 15 minutes late, still wearing his white coat over an expensive suit. He barely looked at Lila as they ran through the motions. Stand here, say these words, sign this paper. The minister's voice droned on about love and commitment and cherishing each other until death, and Lila wanted to scream that it was all a lie. When they reached the part where the bride and groom were supposed to kiss, Callum looked at the minister with something close to disdain. Is that necessary for the rehearsal? The minister stammered. Well, traditionally, we'll manage it during the actual ceremony. Let's move on. Lila felt her face flush with humiliation. She wasn't asking for romance, but basic courtesy would have been nice. After the rehearsal, Helena pulled Lila aside while Callum spoke with the minister about timing. I know this isn't what you dreamed of. Lila forced a smile. I don't think anyone dreams of marrying for a business deal. No, but dreams change. Circumstances change. What matters is that you're both getting what you need. Helena's gaze softened slightly. My son isn't cruel, Lila. He's just broken. Lost his father at 10 years old. Watched him collapse at a soccer game, surrounded by thousands of people who couldn't help. I sent him to boarding school a year later because I couldn't handle my own grief, let alone his. He learned early that depending on people leads to pain, so he stopped depending on anyone. The words should have made Lila feel sympathy. Instead, they just made her tired. That doesn't excuse treating people like props in his personal stage play. No, it doesn't. But maybe it explains it. The wedding day dawned gray and cold, rain streaking the windows of Lila's bedroom. She woke at 5, unable to sleep, and spent 2 hours staring at the white dress hanging on her closet door. Nora knocked softly at 7. You don't have to do this, sweetheart. We'll find another way. But they both knew there was no other way. Not in time to save Deirdre's failing heart. Lila showered, dried her hair, let Nora pin it up in a simple bun with baby's breath woven through. She put on the white dress, slipped her feet into shoes that would probably give her blisters, and looked at herself one last time in the mirror. The woman staring back looked like a bride, felt like a fraud. The chapel was just as cold and gray as it had been during the rehearsal. Rain drummed against the windows. No flowers decorated the altar. Callum had vetoed them as unnecessary. No music played, also deemed unnecessary. The only guests were Helena, Nora, and a hospital administrator serving as legal witness. Lila walked down the short aisle alone, her heels clicking against the worn wooden floor. Callum stood at the altar in an expensive charcoal suit, his face expressionless, checking his phone until the administrator cleared his throat pointedly. The ceremony was perfunctory. The minister read through the traditional vows with all the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. When he asked Callum to repeat the words, Callum's voice was flat, emotionless, each word delivered like a diagnosis. I, Callum Ashford, take you, Emma, Lila. The correction escaped before Lila could stop herself. My name is Lila. Callum's jaw tightened, the only sign of irritation. Lila Brennan. For the purposes of this legal arrangement, just read the standard vows, Dr. Ashford. Lila kept her voice steady, refusing to let him reduce their marriage, fake or not, to a business transaction in front of witnesses. He stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in those steel blue eyes. Then he began again, speaking the traditional words without inflection or warmth. Lila repeated them back, each word feeling like another nail in the coffin of the future she'd once imagined for herself. When the minister announced they could seal their union with a kiss, Callum leaned in and brushed his lips against Lila's for exactly half a second. It wasn't a kiss. It was a checkbox being marked complete. The minister pronounced them husband and wife with obvious relief. Helena stood, clapping politely. Nora's expression was unreadable. Callum checked his watch. I have surgery in 45 minutes. The driver will take you to the penthouse. He pulled a key card from his pocket and handed it to Lila like he was handing over a parking stub. Code is 0418. Don't change it. And then he walked out. Didn't kiss her again. Didn't take her hand. Didn't acknowledge that they'd just gotten married. Just turned and left, his white coat billowing behind him like a superhero cape in a medical drama. Lila stood in the empty chapel, holding a key card, wearing a white dress, and feeling like the world's biggest fool. Helena approached, her expression sympathetic. He's not always like this. Yes, he is. Lila's voice came out hollow. This is exactly who he is. She changed in the chapel bathroom, folding the white dress carefully and placing it in the garment bag. When she emerged, Nora was waiting. "I can still call this off. We can find another way." Lila shook her head. "It's done. And Mom needs this." The driver, a professional man in his 60s who introduced himself as James, helped her into a black town car. The drive to Back Bay took 15 minutes through rain-slicked streets. Lila watched the city pass by, trying to memorize everything about this day. The way the rain made the windows blur, the smell of leather seats, the weight of the simple gold band on her left hand. She was Mrs. Callum Ashford now. The thought made her want to laugh or cry or possibly both. The penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the Charles River. James escorted her to a private elevator, using a key to access the top floor. The doors opened directly into the living space, and Lila stepped into a world so different from her cramped row house in South Boston that it might as well have been another planet. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 3 walls, offering panoramic views of the city and river. The furniture was expensive and minimal, all clean lines and neutral colors. Everything smelled like leather and money, and the kind of air freshener that probably cost more per ounce than Lila's perfume. A woman in her 60s appeared from somewhere deeper in the apartment. She had gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, kind eyes, and a slight Irish accent that immediately reminded Lila of her grandmother. "Mrs. Ashford? I'm Patricia Walsh, the housekeeper. Let me show you around." The tour was brief and depressing. Master suite, off limits to Lila. Guest suite, hers, complete with a bed large enough to sleep 4 and a bathroom bigger than her childhood bedroom. Kitchen, where a chef came Monday through Friday to prepare meals. Study, also off limits. Living room, for entertaining guests only. "Where can I just exist?" Lila heard the exhaustion in her own voice. Patricia's expression softened. "Anywhere he's not, dear, which, given Dr. Ashford's schedule, is most of the apartment most of the time." She left Lila alone in the guest suite with instructions to call if she needed anything. Lila sat on the edge of the enormous bed and looked around at her new temporary home. Beautiful, expensive, utterly impersonal. Her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. "Surgery scheduled for your mother. Dr. Ashford's team will perform the procedure Monday morning, 3 days from now." Her mother would get the surgery that might save her life. And all it had cost was Lila's dignity and a year of her life married to a man who couldn't even be bothered to pretend he cared. She lay back on the bed, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in this enormous apartment, she could hear the hum of expensive appliances and climate control systems. Outside, the rain had stopped, and late afternoon sunlight was breaking through the clouds. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a text from an unknown number. "Hospital gala Saturday, 7 p.m. Dress in your closet, hair up, minimal jewelry. C.A." No, "how are you?" No, "settling in okay?" Just instructions delivered with clinical efficiency. Lila typed back, "You're welcome for the wedding. It was lovely, very romantic." She waited, but no response came. With a sigh, she hauled herself off the bed and went to explore the closet Patricia had mentioned. Inside, she found an emerald evening gown that probably cost more than 3 months of her nursing salary. A note pinned to the hanger. "Wear this. You'll represent the Ashford name appropriately. H.A." Even Helena was giving her instructions now. Lila pulled the dress down, held it up to her body, and looked at herself in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back looked like someone playing dress-up in clothes that didn't belong to her. 1 year. She could survive 1 year. She hung the dress back up, changed into sweatpants and an old t-shirt from nursing school, and curled up in the window seat overlooking the Charles River. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere out there, her mother was lying in a hospital bed, getting ready for a surgery that might save her life. And somewhere in this city, Callum Ashford was doing whatever cold, efficient, arrogant cardiac surgeons did with their Saturday evenings. Lila pulled her knees to her chest and watched the city lights begin to twinkle on as darkness fell. This was her life now, at least for the next 12 months. She just hoped she'd still recognize herself when it was over. The hospital gala occupied the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons, all crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes, and the kind of forced elegance that made Lila's skin crawl. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the penthouse, wearing the emerald gown Helena had selected, and barely recognized her reflection. Patricia had helped with her hair, an elaborate updo that required approximately 7,000 bobby pins and what felt like half a can of hairspray. The dress fit perfectly, hugging curves Lila usually hid beneath scrubs and oversized sweaters. She looked like someone's trophy wife. The thought made her stomach turn. Callum emerged from his suite at precisely 7 o'clock, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than her nursing school tuition. He glanced at her, his expression unchanging, and delivered what might have been the closest thing to a compliment he was capable of. "You'll do." Lila smiled sweetly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Your enthusiasm is overwhelming." Something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or surprise that she dare talk back. "The car is waiting. We're already 3 minutes behind schedule." The drive to the hotel took 12 minutes. Callum spent 11 of them reviewing talking points on his phone, occasionally muttering corrections to himself. Lila watched the city lights blur past her window and wondered what she'd done to deserve this particular circle of hell. At the hotel entrance, Callum finally looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the dress and the hair and the careful makeup Patricia had applied with the skill of a professional artist. At the gala, you'll smile. You'll make polite conversation with board members and their wives. You'll laugh at their jokes, even if they're not funny. And most importantly, you'll let me lead discussions about hospital business. Lila turned to face him fully, her patience evaporating. "No." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Excuse me?" "I said no. I'm not a prop. I'm an ICU nurse who knows more about patient care than half the people in that ballroom. I'll be polite. I'll be professional. But I won't be silent." Callum's jaw tightened, the first real sign of emotion she'd seen all evening. "I'm paying for your mother's surgery. The least you can do is what? Pretend to be a mindless decoration? I agreed to play your wife, not your servant. There's a difference." They stared at each other in the dim interior of the car, tension crackling between them like static electricity. Finally, Callum's expression shifted into something that might have been grudging respect. "Fine. But if you embarrass me professionally, there will be consequences." "Likewise." James opened the car door, breaking the moment. Callum exited first, then turned and offered his hand to help Lila out. The gesture was probably automatic, the kind of thing drilled into him at expensive boarding schools and country club dinners. But when Lila placed her hand in his, she felt the coldness of his skin and wondered if anything about this man ran warm. The ballroom was already crowded with Boston's medical elite. Lila recognized several attending physicians from Mass General, along with board members whose photographs hung in the hospital's main lobby. Everyone held champagne glasses and wore expressions of careful sophistication. The orchestra played something classical and forgettable in one corner. Helena appeared almost immediately, resplendent in navy silk. She kissed Callum's cheek, a gesture he tolerated rather than returned, and took both of Lila's hands in greeting. "You look lovely. Ready to play the part?" Lila forced a smile. "As ready as I'll ever be." The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. Callum guided her through the crowd with one hand resting lightly on her lower back, steering her toward important conversations and away from potential pitfalls. Lila found herself shaking hands with Dr. Harrison, the board chairman, a man in his 70s with white hair and eyes that missed nothing. Dr. Ashford, and this must be the lovely bride we've heard so much about. Callum's hand tightened slightly against Lila's back. Dr. Harrison, may I present my wife, Lila? She's an ICU nurse at Mass General. Harrison's eyebrows rose with what looked like genuine surprise. A nurse? How refreshing. My late wife was a nurse. Always said they were the real heroes of medicine while we doctors just took the credit. Lila felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. Your wife sounds like a wise woman. That she was. Tell me, Mrs. Ashford, how did you and our esteemed Dr. Ashford meet? The hospital grapevine is full of speculation, but I prefer to hear things from the source. The question hung in the air between them. Lila felt Callum go very still beside her, clearly unprepared for this line of inquiry. She thought about the real story, the emergency room, the business proposition, the cold transaction masquerading as marriage. Then she thought about her mother lying in a hospital bed, waiting for surgery that would save her life. She smiled at Dr. Harrison and let the lie flow smoothly from her lips. He saved my mother's life. She went into cardiac arrest, and Callum's team brought her back. I started bringing him coffee every morning for a week, trying to find the words to thank him properly. He finally asked me to dinner just to get me to stop lurking around the cardiac wing. Harrison laughed, a genuine sound of delight. And he proposed? In the hospital chapel. Very romantic for a man who practically lives in operating rooms. Indeed. Well, congratulations to you both. Dr. Ashford, you've chosen well. A woman who understands the demands of medicine is a treasure. Harrison moved on to greet other guests, leaving Lila and Callum standing alone in the middle of the crowd. Callum's hand dropped from her back. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. That was impressive. You're welcome. Next time, maybe prepare a cover story before throwing me to the wolves. His lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Noted. The evening wore on. Lila found herself actually enjoying parts of it, particularly when she ended up in conversation with Dr. Sterling, a retired cardiac surgeon who spoke about medicine with genuine passion rather than clinical detachment. He was in his late 60s, with kind eyes and laugh lines that suggested he'd spent more time smiling than scowling. So you're the woman who finally got Callum to settle down. I've known that boy since he was a resident. Never thought I'd see the day. Lila glanced across the room to where Callum stood speaking with a group of hospital administrators, his posture perfect, his expression neutral. I'm not sure settled down is the right phrase, more like fulfilled a requirement. Sterling's eyes sharpened. Cynical for a newlywed. Realistic for someone who knows what marriage to Dr. Ashford actually entails. Which is? Lila considered her answer carefully. Sterling seemed genuinely kind, but he was also Callum's colleague and possibly his friend. Let's just say he's very focused on his career, which I respect, but it doesn't leave much room for anything else. Sterling studied her for a long moment. Callum lost his father young. Watched him die, actually. Soccer game, surrounded by thousands of people and no one could save him. The boy learned early that caring about people leads to pain, so he stopped caring. Focused everything on medicine because hearts he could fix. Emotions, not so much. The words should have made Lila feel sympathy. Instead, they just reinforced what she already knew. Callum Ashford had built walls so high and thick that nothing and no one was getting through. That must have been difficult for him. Still is. But maybe that's where you come in. Before Lila could respond, Callum appeared at her elbow. We should circulate. There are several board members I need to speak with before dinner. Sterling winked at Lila. Duty calls. Lovely to meet you, Mrs. Ashford. Callum guided her toward another cluster of important people, and the evening continued its exhausting march forward. By the time dinner was announced, Lila's feet ached from the designer heels, and her face hurt from maintaining a pleasant expression. The meal was elaborate, multiple courses, each more pretentious than the last. Lila sat beside Callum at a table with board members and their spouses, making conversation about topics she had no interest in, while picking at food that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. Halfway through the main course, Dr. Harrison's wife, a woman named Margaret with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, leaned toward Lila. You seem different from Callum's usual type. Lila wasn't sure Callum had a type, given that he seemed fundamentally incapable of human connection. How so? You have opinions. Express them freely. Most of the women he's dated were more decorative. He's dated? The question escaped before Lila could stop it. Margaret smiled knowingly. Occasionally. Brief encounters that never went anywhere. His mother despaired of him ever settling down, which is why this marriage came as such a surprise. Lila felt trapped by the conversation, unsure how to respond without revealing the truth. She settled for vague deflection. Sometimes the right person appears when you least expect them. Indeed, though I must say, I never expected Callum to choose someone so substantial. You're not intimidated by him at all, are you? Should I be? Most people are. He has a way of making everyone around him feel inadequate. But you... Margaret studied her thoughtfully. You look at him like he's just a man, not a genius surgeon or a billionaire heir. Just a man. That's rare. Before Lila could formulate a response, Callum's hand found hers under the table. The gesture startled her, the first voluntary touch he'd initiated since their half-second wedding kiss. His fingers threaded through hers, his palm warm against her skin. It took Lila a moment to realize why. Dr. Harrison was watching them from across the table, his expression thoughtful. Callum was performing for the audience. She let him hold her hand, even though his touch felt foreign and strange, even though she wanted to pull away and remind him that fake marriages didn't require fake affection. But her mother's surgery was scheduled for Monday morning, and Lila would endure far worse than holding hands with an arrogant stranger to ensure that happened. After dinner, the orchestra resumed playing, and couples began drifting toward the dance floor. Callum stood, still holding Lila's hand, and pulled her gently to her feet. We should dance. It's expected. How romantic. The sarcasm was automatic. He led her onto the floor, one hand settling at her waist, the other still clasping her fingers. They moved together to the music, a slow waltz that required them to stand closer than they'd been since the wedding ceremony. Lila could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated that probably came in a bottle shaped like architectural minimalism. You did well tonight. Lila looked up at him, surprised by what might have been a compliment. Thanks. You were marginally less insufferable than usual. His lips twitched again, that almost smile that never quite materialized. I'm trying. Trying what? To be human? To be less difficult. My mother said you'd be good for me. I'm starting to think she might be right. The admission caught Lila off guard. She studied his face, looking for signs of mockery or manipulation, but found only honesty. It didn't make her like him, but it made him slightly less hate-worthy. Your mother wants you to be happy, or at least appear happy enough to fool the board. And you? What do you want? The question was so unexpected that Lila answered honestly. I want my mother to survive her surgery. I want to get through this year without losing myself. And I want you to stop treating me like an inconvenient obligation. Callum was quiet for several measures of music. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more genuine than she'd heard before. I don't know how to do this. Any of this. I've spent my entire adult life avoiding exactly this kind of connection. Then why agree to the marriage? Because I wanted the chief position. And because my mother was right, the board cares about stability. But also, he trailed off, seeming to struggle with something. But also what? I'm tired of being alone, even if I don't know how to be anything else. The honesty in those words hit Lila like a punch to the chest. She'd been so focused on her own anger and resentment that she hadn't considered he might be struggling too. Not with the same things. His struggles were born from privilege and emotional unavailability rather than desperation, but struggling nonetheless. The song ended. Callum released her, stepping back with that same careful distance he maintained everywhere else. The moment of vulnerability had passed, locked away behind walls that probably had walls of their own. They stayed at the gala until 11, making the required rounds and playing their parts with increasing ease. By the time they returned to the penthouse, Lila's exhaustion had reached bone-deep levels. She kicked off the designer heels the moment the elevator doors closed, groaning with relief. Callum watched her with something that might have been amusement. Those looked painful. Beauty is pain, isn't that what they tell us? She carried the shoes into the penthouse, padding across the expensive hardwood in bare feet. Thank you for tonight. I know it wasn't easy. You made it easier. He loosened his bow tie, the first sign of relaxation she'd seen all evening. The board was impressed. Harrison specifically mentioned how well suited we seem. That's the goal, isn't it? Convince them you're stable and mature enough for the chief position. Yes. He paused in the middle of the living room, hands in his pockets. Lila, about what I said while we were dancing. You don't have to explain. We all say things we don't mean when we're performing. What if I meant it? The question hung between them, heavy with implications Lila wasn't ready to examine. She clutched the shoes to her chest like a shield. Then we should probably talk about it, when we're both less exhausted and more sober. I didn't drink anything tonight. I know, neither did I, which makes this conversation even more dangerous. She moved toward the hallway leading to her suite. Good night, Callum. Good night. Lila closed herself in a room, leaned against the door, and tried to make sense of the evening. The man she danced with, who'd admitted to being tired of loneliness, didn't match the cold surgeon who'd handed her a key card and walked away from their wedding. She didn't know which version was real, or if both were masks covering something deeper. She changed into pajamas, washed off the careful makeup, and pulled the 1,000 bobby pins from her hair. By the time she crawled into bed, it was past midnight, and her mind was spinning with contradictions. Sleep came fitfully. She woke twice from dreams she couldn't quite remember, fragments of music and cold hands and emerald dresses that transformed into hospital gowns. Sunday morning arrived with pale November sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Lila woke to her phone buzzing, a text from Nora. Church at 10, then Sunday dinner. Bring your husband. That's an order, not a request. Lila groaned into her pillow. The idea of dragging Callum to her grandmother's cramped row house in South Boston seemed like a recipe for disaster. But refusing Nora wasn't an option, not unless Lila wanted to face consequences far worse than an uncomfortable afternoon. She found Callum in his study, already dressed for the day in casual clothes that probably still cost more than her monthly salary. He looked up when she knocked on the open door. "My grandmother invited us to Sunday dinner." His expression didn't change. "I don't do family gatherings." "She's 78 years old and she wants to meet her grandson-in-law. It's one meal." "I have patient charts to review." Lila crossed her arms, channeling every ounce of stubbornness she'd inherited from 3 generations of Irish-American women. "Callum, it's one meal. 3 hours maximum. My grandmother makes the best pot roast in Boston, and she'll love you, or terrorize you, or possibly both. But either way, you're coming." He studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the cost of refusal against the path of least resistance. Finally, he sighed. 2 hours. Then I leave. 2.5. Fine, but I'm taking my own car in case I need to leave early. Whatever makes you feel better. They drove separately to South Boston, Lila in her aging Honda, Callum in something sleek and German that probably had a price tag with too many zeros. She arrived first, letting herself into the familiar warmth of her grandmother's kitchen. The smell of roasting meat and fresh bread immediately wrapped around her like a hug. Nora looked up from the stove, wooden spoon in hand. "Where's this husband of yours?" "Parking his ridiculously expensive car. Probably trying to figure out if it's safe in this neighborhood." Nora's eyes sharpened. "Is he a snob?" "He's complicated. Just be patient with him, okay? He's not used to family." The doorbell rang precisely 3 minutes later. Lila answered it to find Callum standing on the narrow stoop, looking profoundly uncomfortable in his cashmere sweater and designer jeans. Behind him, his car gleamed like a spaceship among the practical Toyotas and Fords lining the street. Nora appeared at Lila's shoulder before she could speak. The old woman looked Callum up and down with the same critical eye she used to inspect produce at the farmer's market. "So you're the arrogant doctor who married my granddaughter." Callum blinked, clearly unprepared for such directness. "Mrs. Brennan, It's Nora. And take off those fancy shoes. You'll scuff my floors." Lila pressed her lips together to hide a smile as Callum carefully removed his Italian leather shoes and left them by the door. Nora led them into the small kitchen, where Deirdre sat at the table looking pale, but significantly better than she had a week ago. The pre-surgical medications were doing their job. Deirdre's face lit up when she saw Lila. "Baby girl." Then her gaze shifted to Callum, and something softer entered her expression. "Dr. Ashford, thank you for everything you're doing." Callum's discomfort was palpable. "The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 6. My team will take excellent care of you." "I know. Lila trusts you, which means I trust you too." The words seemed to affect Callum in ways Lila didn't fully understand. His jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffened, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable. Then the mask slid back into place, and he was Dr. Callum Ashford again, composed, controlled, untouchable. Nora directed everyone to set the table, and Callum found himself handed a stack of mismatched plates and pointed toward the dining room. Lila watched him navigate the cramped space, clearly out of his element, and felt an unexpected flicker of sympathy. The meal itself was a revelation. Nora had prepared her signature pot roast, beef so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork, carrots glazed with natural sweetness, potatoes that melted on the tongue, gravy rich enough to qualify as a religious experience. Fresh Irish soda bread, still warm from the oven, sat in a basket, butter pooling in golden puddles beside it. Nora said grace, her papery hand reaching for Callum's on one side and Lila's on the other. Lila watched Callum bow his head, clearly uncomfortable with the ritual, but unwilling to cause offense. When Nora finished, he squeezed Lila's hand gently before releasing it. The gesture surprised her. maybe even surprised him. Conversation during the meal was surprisingly natural. Nora drew Callum out with pointed questions about his work, his background, his thoughts on everything from hospital politics to the best way to season cast iron. Deirdre asked about his father, a question that made Callum's fork pause halfway to his mouth. He died when I was 10. Aneurysm. Deirdre's expression filled with compassion. I'm sorry. Losing a parent young changes everything. Yes. Callum's voice was carefully neutral, but Lila caught the tightness around his eyes. It does. Nora, never one to let silence linger, changed the subject to lighter topics. She told stories about Lila's childhood, the time she'd tried to give the neighborhood dogs checkups with her toy medical kit, the phase where she'd insisted on being called Nurse Nancy, the high school science fair project about cardiac function that had won state championships. Callum listened with what looked like genuine interest. At one point, he even smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and infinitely more human. After dinner, Nora conscripted Callum to help with dishes. Lila started to protest, but Nora silenced her with a look. You and your mother go rest. The doctor can dry dishes. Lila watched Callum navigate her grandmother's kitchen, accepting a dish towel and following Nora's brisk instructions. The sight of him drying mismatched plates with the same focused concentration he probably applied to surgery was somehow endearing. Deirdre touched Lila's arm gently. He's not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone colder, crueler. But he looks at you when you're not watching, and when you speak, he actually listens. Lila felt heat creep into her cheeks. It's an act, Mom. We're playing parts. Maybe, but good acting requires some truth underneath. Deirdre squeezed her hand. Give him time. People can surprise you. From the kitchen came the sound of Nora interrogating Callum about his intentions. Lila couldn't hear the specific words, but the tone was unmistakable, her grandmother in full protective mode. When they finally emerged, Callum looked slightly shell-shocked, but intact. Nora was smiling, which Lila took as a good sign. Your grandmother is formidable. She likes you. If she didn't, you'd know. They said their goodbyes as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting everything in golden light. Nora hugged Callum with surprising fierceness, then whispered something in his ear that made his expression flicker with surprise. In the car, Lila had convinced him they should ride together. Callum was unusually quiet. They were halfway back to Back Bay before he finally spoke. Your grandmother told me not to break your heart. What did you say? That I'd do my best. He glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. She's right to worry. I'm not good at this. Any of this. You did fine today. I felt like an anthropologist studying an unfamiliar culture. Your family has rituals, inside jokes, a whole language of gestures and expressions I don't understand. Lila studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows. You could learn, if you wanted to. I don't know if I remember how. The confession was so raw, so honest, that Lila found herself reaching across the console to touch his arm. He flinched slightly, not from fear, but from surprise at the contact. She pulled her hand back. Sorry, you're not as alone as you think you are. He didn't respond, but something in his expression shifted, softened. The next morning arrived too early. Lila woke at 4:30, unable to sleep, her mind spinning with anxiety about her mother's surgery. She dressed in scrubs, planning to spend the day at the hospital, and found Callum already in the kitchen drinking coffee. I'm coming with you. He looked up, surprised. The surgery will take 6 hours. You'll just be waiting. She's my mother. I'm not staying away. I wasn't suggesting you should. I just meant... He trailed off, seeming to struggle with something. I perform better when family isn't watching. No offense. None taken. But I'm still coming. They drove to the hospital together in his car, the city still dark, the streets mostly empty. Lila watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, and tried to quiet the panic rising in her chest. At the hospital, Callum walked her to the surgical waiting area, his hand resting lightly on her lower back. The gesture felt protective rather than performative, and Lila found herself grateful for it. I'll take care of her. His voice was low, serious, stripped of the usual clinical detachment. I promise. I know you will. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the surgical wing. Lila watched him disappear through the double doors, then settled into one of the uncomfortable chairs to wait. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. Lila tried to read, tried to scroll through her phone, tried to think about anything except what was happening in that operating room. Other families came and went, their own vigils playing out in the same space. At one point, Dr. Sterling appeared with coffee and a kind smile. Thought you might need this. Waiting is the hardest part. You know Callum well? Known him since he was a cocky resident who thought he knew everything. Sterling settled into the chair beside her. Brilliant surgeon even then, but absolutely insufferable. No bedside manner, no patience for anyone slower than him, no interest in anything except perfecting his technique. Sounds familiar. Sterling chuckled. I'm sure it does. But here's the thing about Callum. Underneath all that arrogance is genuine fear. Fear of failing, fear of losing someone the way he lost his father. So he keeps everyone at arm's length and pretends not to care. Safer that way. Except it's not really safer, just lonelier. Exactly. Which is why I was glad to hear he'd gotten married, even if the circumstances are unusual. Lila's head snapped up. What do you mean? Sterling's eyes were kind, but knowing. I've been practicing medicine for 40 years. I recognize a marriage of convenience when I see one. The question is whether either of you will let it become something real. Before Lila could formulate a response, the surgical waiting room doors opened and Callum appeared, still in his scrubs, surgical cap pushed back from his forehead. His expression was unreadable. Lila stood on shaking legs. Mom? Surgery was successful. The new technique worked exactly as we hoped. Her heart function should improve significantly over the next few weeks. He moved closer, his voice gentling. She's in recovery now. You can see her in about an hour. The relief hit Lila like a wave, making her knees weak. She swayed slightly, and Callum's hands came up to steady her, gripping her shoulders firmly. Easy. When did you last eat? I don't remember. Yesterday? He guided her back to the chair, then turned to Dr. Sterling. Can you stay with her? I need to check on the patient, but I don't want her alone. Sterling nodded, and Callum disappeared back through the surgical doors. The older doctor smiled at Lila. See? He cares. He just doesn't know how to show it properly. Lila sat in the waiting room, her hands shaking with relief, and tried to process everything. Her mother was alive. The surgery had worked, and Callum Ashford, cold, arrogant, impossible Callum Ashford, had looked at her with something approaching genuine concern. Maybe there was a human being buried under all those walls after all. When she finally saw her mother, Deirdre was pale and groggy, but alive. Beautifully, wonderfully alive. Lila held her hand and cried. and Deirdre squeezed back weakly.
Told you he was good.
Yeah, Mom. You were right. Lila stayed at the hospital until visiting hours ended, then took a cab back to the penthouse. She found Callum in his study, still in scrubs, reviewing post-operative notes on his tablet. He looked up when she entered. How is she? Tired, hurting, but alive, thanks to you. Lila leaned against the doorframe, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. I don't know how to thank you properly. You don't need to thank me. I was doing my job. It was more than that. You promised you'd take care of her, and you did. Callum set down the tablet, his expression unreadable. Lila, about the arrangement, I should let you work. She pushed off the doorframe, suddenly afraid of whatever he might say. Good night, Callum. She escaped to her suite before he could respond, closed the door, and pressed her forehead against the cool wood. Everything was changing too fast. The man who'd been nothing but cold efficiency 2 weeks ago was showing cracks in his armor, and Lila didn't know what that meant for either of them. 1 year. She just had to survive 1 year. But as she crawled into bed and closed her eyes, she wondered if surviving was going to be harder than she'd anticipated. Not because Callum was cruel, but because he was starting to seem human. And that was infinitely more dangerous. Over the next 2 weeks, something shifted between them. Nothing dramatic, no declarations or grand gestures, just small changes that accumulated like snow building toward an avalanche. Callum started leaving coffee for her in the morning, exactly how she liked it. Lila found herself cooking meals on her days off and leaving portions for him in the refrigerator. They fell into a routine of eating dinner together when their schedules aligned, the conversations gradually moving from stilted small talk to genuine discussion. He asked about her work at the ICU. She asked about his research. They discovered a shared appreciation for old movies and terrible puns. Sometimes, late at night, when they were both too tired to maintain their respective walls, they'd talk about real things. Childhoods, dreams, regrets. Lila learned that Callum collected vinyl records and couldn't cook to save his life. He learned that she'd wanted to be a doctor but couldn't afford medical school, that she played piano but hadn't touched one in years, that she was terrified of failure and heights and disappointing the people she loved. The Sunday dinners at Nora's became a regular occurrence. Callum stopped trying to leave early, sometimes even helping cook. Nora taught him to make Irish soda bread, patiently correcting his technique when he tried to treat baking like a precise science rather than an art. 3 weeks after the wedding, Lila returned from an overnight shift to find Callum asleep on the couch in the living room, medical journals scattered around him, his reading glasses askew on his face. He looked younger this way, vulnerable, almost sweet. She grabbed a blanket from the closet and draped it over him carefully. He stirred slightly but didn't wake, just pulled the blanket closer and settled deeper into sleep. In the morning, she found a note on the kitchen counter. Thank you for the blanket, and for not taking embarrassing photos. C. The gesture made her smile for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. 4 weeks in, the hospital announced Callum's appointment as chief of cardiac surgery. He came home that evening with champagne and something resembling genuine happiness in his eyes. We did it. Lila accepted the glass, even though she rarely drank. You did it. I just played a supporting role. Don't diminish your contribution. Harrison specifically mentioned how much the board appreciated meeting you. Said you brought out a side of me they hadn't seen before. What side is that? The human one, apparently. He touched his glass to hers, the crystal ringing softly. Thank you, Lila, for everything. They drank to his success, standing in the expensive kitchen of his expensive penthouse, and Lila tried to ignore the warmth spreading through her chest. This was supposed to be temporary, a business arrangement with a clear end date. She wasn't supposed to be starting to care about him. But somewhere between Sunday dinners and late-night conversations and the way he'd looked at her after saving her mother's life, something had shifted. The walls were still there, but they were developing cracks, and Lila was terrified of what might happen when they finally came down. Thanksgiving arrived with the kind of cold that made Boston feel like the edge of the world. Lila woke early in the penthouse, watching frost patterns form on the windows while the city below still slept. In 6 months, the arrangement would end. In 6 months, she'd walk away from this borrowed life and return to whatever counted as normal. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it sat heavy in her chest like undigested truth. Nora had insisted they come for Thanksgiving dinner at 2 o'clock sharp, which meant Lila had exactly 4 hours to convince Callum that skipping the holiday wasn't an option. She found him in his study, already reviewing patient files despite it being a national holiday dedicated to rest and gratitude. "We need to be at my grandmother's by 2. He didn't look up from his tablet. "I have 3 post-operative patients requiring monitoring." "You have residents for that, and you promised Nora you'd come." "I don't recall promising anything." Lila crossed her arms, channeling 3 generations of Irish stubbornness. "Callum, put down the tablet." He finally looked at her, one eyebrow raised in that aristocratic way that used to irritate her, but now just seemed like part of who he was. "Is this going to be a lecture about work-life balance? Because I've heard it before." "This is going to be a reminder that you married into a family that takes holidays seriously. Nora's been cooking since yesterday. She's expecting us. And unless you want to explain to a 78-year-old Irish grandmother why you couldn't spare 3 hours on Thanksgiving, I suggest you get dressed." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. 3 hours? "Maximum. Scout's honor." "You were never a scout." "How do you know?" "Because you told me last week when I mentioned my brief tenure in prep school scouting programs." He set down the tablet, and Lila realized with quiet surprise that he'd been listening. Really listening. "Fine, 3 hours. But if anyone asks me to watch football, I'm leaving." "Noted. Though I should warn you that Nora's neighbor, Mr. O'Sullivan, usually comes over for the game." Callum groaned, but he was already standing, already accepting the inevitable. Progress. The drive to South Boston took 20 minutes through nearly empty streets. Lila watched the city transform from gleaming towers to working-class neighborhoods, the change happening gradually like a photograph developing in reverse. Callum navigated the unfamiliar streets with careful attention, occasionally asking for directions even though his car's GPS could have guided them perfectly. She appreciated the gesture more than she could articulate. Nora's row house smelled like every Thanksgiving Lila had ever known: roasting turkey, sage stuffing, cinnamon from pies cooling on the counter. The scent hit them the moment they entered, wrapping around Lila like a beloved blanket. Callum paused in the doorway, and she realized this was probably the first real Thanksgiving he'd experienced in decades. Nora appeared from the kitchen, flour dusting her apron, her face flushed from the heat of cooking. "There you are. Callum, get in here. I need someone tall to reach the good serving platters." He went without protest, and Lila felt something tender bloom in her chest at the sight of him following her grandmother's brisk instructions. She found Deirdre in the dining room, setting the table with the same mismatched china they'd used for every holiday Lila could remember. Her mother looked healthier than she had in months. The surgery had given her back something precious, not just time, but quality of life. Color had returned to her cheeks. Her movements were steadier. The haunted look that came from struggling to breathe had faded. "He's good for you." Deirdre's voice was soft, knowing. It's not like that. We have an arrangement. Arrangements don't make a man learn to bake Irish soda bread, or stay for Sunday dinners, or look at you like you're the only real thing in his carefully controlled world. Lila busied herself with folding napkins, unwilling to examine that observation too closely. He's just being polite. Sweetheart, I've watched that man interact with people at the hospital. Polite is not a word anyone would use to describe Dr. Ashford. But with you? With us? He's trying. That means something. Before Lila could respond, Callum emerged from the kitchen carrying an enormous turkey on Nora's best serving platter. He navigated the cramped dining room with surprising grace, setting the bird in the center of the table with obvious pride. Nora appeared behind him. Look at that. Perfect golden brown. Callum, you did excellent work with the basting. His ears turned slightly pink. I followed your instructions precisely. That's the problem with you doctor types. Always so precise. Cook requires instinct, not measurements. But Nora's eyes were warm, affectionate. Still, you did well. They sat down to a feast that represented hours of labor and decades of tradition. Turkey carved by Callum under Nora's watchful instruction. Mashed potatoes whipped with butter and cream until they achieved the consistency of clouds. Stuffing fragrant with sage and onions and some secret ingredient Nora refused to reveal. Green bean casserole topped with crispy onions, cranberry sauce, both the jellied kind from a can because Lila loved it, and the homemade kind with orange zest because Nora insisted real food came from real ingredients. Rolls, still warm enough to melt butter into golden pools. Nora said grace, her papery hands reaching for Callum's on one side and Deirdre's on the other. The circle completed with Lila between her mother and the man she'd married for all the wrong reasons and was starting to care about for reasons she couldn't quite name. Lord, we give thanks for this meal, for the hands that prepared it, for the roof that shelters us, and for new family brought into old traditions. Bless this food and all who share it. Amen. Amen. The word came from all of them, even Callum, though his voice was quieter, more uncertain. The meal unfolded with the easy rhythm of family comfortable in each other's presence. Stories layered over stories, Nora recounting Thanksgivings from Lila's childhood, Deirdre adding details and corrections, Lila protesting that she'd never actually tried to cook the turkey alive as a child. You were 4. You thought it needed a bath before dinner. That's completely reasonable logic for a 4-year-old. Callum listened with genuine attention, asking questions that drew out more stories, more laughter. Lila watched him absorb her family's history like he was memorizing something precious, and wondered what Thanksgivings had been like in the Ashford household before his father died. Probably silent, formal. Everything his life seemed to be before she'd crashed into it, with her desperate bargain and her loud family and her refusal to let him hide behind walls. After the main course, Nora conscripted Callum to help clear plates. Lila started to protest. He was a guest, technically, but Nora silenced her with a look. The doctor can handle dishes. You and your mother go rest. In the kitchen, Nora handed Callum a dish towel and pointed at the sink full of soapy water. You wash, I'll dry. Shouldn't that be reversed? You cooked. My kitchen, my rules. Wash. Lila watched from the doorway as Callum carefully washed each dish, his movements precise even in this domestic task. Nora dried them with practiced efficiency, storing everything in its proper place. You love her yet? Callum's hand stilled in the water. Mrs. Brennan, it's Nora. And that wasn't really a question. I have eyes. I see how you look at her when she's not watching. Our arrangement is changing. Don't pretend it isn't. Nora's voice was gentle but firm. You can keep lying to yourself if you want, but don't lie to me. And more importantly, don't lie to her. That girl has been hurt enough. Callum resumed washing, his jaw tight. I don't know how to give her what she deserves. Start by being honest, with her, and with yourself. Lila retreated before they could notice her eavesdropping, her heart hammering against her ribs. She curled up on the worn sofa beside her mother, trying to process what she'd overheard. Deirdre studied her face. You hurt? I shouldn't have been listening. But you were. And now you know. Know what? That he's confused? That he doesn't know what he feels? Lila's voice cracked slightly. That doesn't change anything. We have a contract with an expiration date. Contracts can be renegotiated. Deirdre touched Lila's cheek gently. Sweetheart, I know you're scared. But sometimes the best things in life come from the chances we're terrified to take. Dessert was Nora's famous apple pie, flaky crust, cinnamon-spiced filling, vanilla ice cream melting into sweet cream rivers. Callum ate 2 slices, earning Nora's delighted approval. Mr. O'Sullivan arrived with a 6-pack of beer and opinions about the Patriots' chances this season. To everyone's surprise, Callum stayed for the game, asking intelligent questions about plays and penalties. By the time they left, the sun had set and the temperature had dropped below freezing. Lila bundled into her coat while Callum thanked Nora for the meal with genuine warmth. You're family now. That means you come back next week for pot roast. Nora hugged him fiercely, then whispered something Lila couldn't hear. In the car, Callum was unusually quiet. They were halfway to Back Bay before he finally spoke. Your grandmother told me not to waste the gift I've been given. Lila's breath caught. What did you say? That I'd try my best. He glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable in the dashboard lights. Lila, about our arrangement. We should probably talk about that, but not tonight. Not when we're both full of turkey and pie and feeling sentimental because of the holiday. When then? I don't know. Soon. Before things get more complicated. They drove the rest of the way in silence that felt heavy with unspoken truths. December arrived with early darkness and the kind of cold that made bones ache. Lila threw herself into work at the ICU, picking up extra shifts, volunteering for the least desirable rotations, anything to avoid thinking about the conversation she and Callum needed to have. But avoidance only worked until it didn't. She came home from a particularly brutal overnight shift to find Callum in the kitchen, actually attempting to make breakfast. Smoke rose from the toaster. Something that might have been scrambled eggs congealed in a pan. Coffee dripped onto the counter from an overfilled pot. He looked up when she entered, defeat written across his features. I was trying to surprise you. Lila surveyed the disaster zone that used to be a pristine kitchen. Well, you succeeded. I'm incompetent at anything that doesn't involve a scalpel. You're not incompetent. You're just untrained. She moved to the stove, turning down the heat, salvaging what she could. Here, I'll show you. They cooked together in the morning light, Lila guiding his hands through the basics of scrambling eggs properly, of timing toast, of measuring coffee grounds. Their fingers brushed, reaching for the same spatula, their shoulders touched, working in the limited space. The casual intimacy of it felt more dangerous than any of the formal events they'd attended as a couple. When they finally sat down to eat the slightly improved breakfast, Callum looked at her across the table with something vulnerable in his eyes. I'm not good at this. At cooking? I noticed. At being a person someone might actually want to be around. I've spent so long being the brilliant asshole that I forgot how to be anything else. Lila set down her fork, her appetite fading. Why are you telling me this? Because in 4 months our arrangement ends, and I'm realizing that I don't want it to. The words hung between them, impossible to ignore or unsay. Lila's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. Callum, I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm just being honest. You asked me to be honest with you. That was before everything got so complicated. When exactly was it simple? We've been complicated since the moment you walked into my office and told me you wouldn't be silent just because I was paying your mother's bills. Despite everything, Lila felt a smile tug at her lips. I was pretty defiant. You were magnificent. His voice softened. You still are. Lila stood abruptly, needing distance, needing air. I need to think about all of this. Can we just table this conversation for a little while? How long is a little while? I don't know. But I can't make any decisions when I'm this exhausted and you're being unexpectedly vulnerable, and everything feels too fragile. Callum nodded slowly. Okay, we'll table it. But Lila, running out of time doesn't make decisions easier. She escaped to her suite, closed the door, and pressed her forehead against the cool wood. Her feelings had become a tangled mess somewhere between resentment and affection, between duty and desire. She'd married him to save her mother, had started to know him through Sunday dinners and late-night conversations, and somewhere in the chaos of fake marriage and real connection, she'd done the stupidest possible thing. She'd started falling for him. The realization sat in her chest like swallowed glass. Christmas decorations appeared throughout Boston, lights strung across streets, wreaths on doors, the smell of roasted chestnuts from vendors on corners. The hospital held its annual holiday party, and Lila found herself once again playing the role of devoted wife, while Callum worked the room with practiced charm. Dr. Harrison cornered them near the punch bowl, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been knowing amusement. You two seem much more comfortable together than you did at the fall gala. Lila smiled, the expression feeling more genuine than it should have. Practice makes perfect. Indeed, though from what I hear, the comfort extends beyond public events. Several nurses mentioned seeing you both at family dinners in South Boston. Callum's hand found the small of Lila's back, the gesture automatic now. Lila's grandmother has adopted me. Resistance was futile. Smart man, knowing when he's outnumbered. Harrison studied them thoughtfully. You know, when your mother first mentioned you were getting married, I had my doubts. Seemed convenient timing, given the chief position. But watching you two these past months, either you're both excellent actors, or something real has developed. Can't it be both? Lila heard herself ask. Harrison laughed. Indeed it can. Enjoy the party, you two, and Merry Christmas. After he walked away, Callum leaned down to murmur in Lila's ear. That was dangerously honest. Maybe I'm tired of lying, even by omission. What are you saying? I don't know. Can we get out of here? They made their excuses and left, driving through the city lit up for Christmas. Callum didn't head toward Back Bay. Instead, he navigated to the public garden, parking near the bridge where swan boats floated in summer. My parents got engaged here. 1985. His voice was quiet, reflective. My mother told me the story once, before she stopped talking about my father. He proposed on this bridge, in the snow, surrounded by people but feeling like they were the only two in the world. Lila looked at the frozen pond, the bare trees, the lights reflecting off the ice. Why are you telling me this? Because I want to do something right. For once. He turned to face her fully. Our arrangement ends in April. 4 months. But I'd like to renegotiate the terms. What kind of renegotiation? The kind where we stop pretending this is just business. where we acknowledged that somewhere between Sunday dinners and learning to make Irish soda bread and you falling asleep on my shoulder during a movie you insisted on watching, this became real. Lila's breath misted in the cold air. Callum, we can't. Why not? Give me one good reason why we can't at least try. Because you don't know how to do relationships. You said so yourself. Then teach me the way you taught me to cook breakfast and talk to your family, and remember that being brilliant doesn't excuse being cruel. What if we try and it doesn't work? What if we ruin whatever this is by pushing it into something it's not meant to be? Callum reached for her hand, his fingers warm despite the cold. What if we don't try and spend the rest of our lives wondering what we missed? Lila looked at their joined hands, at this man who'd been nothing but walls and arrogance 3 months ago, who'd slowly revealed depths and vulnerabilities she hadn't expected, who'd saved her mother's life and learned her grandmother's recipes and listened when she talked about the patients she'd lost and the ones she'd saved. I need time to think about what this means. How much time? I don't know, but I can't make this decision standing in a freezing park on a random Tuesday night. He nodded slowly, disappointment flickering across his features. Okay. But Lila, I meant what I said. This stopped being fake for me a long time ago. The drive back to the penthouse was quiet. Lila stared out the window at the Christmas lights blurring past and tried to untangle her feelings. Fear warred with hope, practicality with possibility. She'd built so many walls of her own, convinced that this marriage was temporary, that she needed to protect her heart from someone incapable of caring for it. But Callum was proving her wrong. Slowly, clumsily, but genuinely proving her wrong. The question was whether she was brave enough to let him. Christmas Eve arrived with snow, the kind of perfect, gentle snow that made the city look like a postcard. Nora had invited them for the traditional family celebration, midnight mass followed by gift exchange and hot cocoa that was more chocolate than milk. Lila arrived early to help with preparations, leaving Callum to finish some last-minute paperwork at the hospital. She found her grandmother in the kitchen, rolling out dough for sugar cookies. You've been avoiding that man. No preamble, no gentle introduction, just Nora's particular brand of uncomfortable honesty. I've been working. You've been hiding. Nora pointed the rolling pin at Lila with the authority of a scepter. That boy told you he has real feelings for you, and you're running scared. I'm being practical. This was supposed to be temporary. Life is temporary, sweetheart. That doesn't mean we don't live it. Nora's expression softened. Your grandfather and I were an arranged marriage. Did I ever tell you that? Lila blinked, surprised. No, you always said you met at a dance. We did. A dance our families arranged specifically so we could meet. My parents and his parents had decided we'd be a good match. I was furious. Thought I deserved to choose my own husband. Nora's hand stilled on the dough, her eyes distant with memory. But I gave him a chance. One date, then another. And somewhere between his terrible jokes and my stubborn pride, we fell in love. Real, messy, complicated love. That's different. You and Grandpa started exactly where you and Callum started, with an arrangement neither of us asked for and both of us resented. The difference is, we were smart enough to recognize a good thing when we stumbled into it. Lila felt tears prick her eyes. What if I'm not brave enough? Then you're not the granddaughter I raised. Nora pulled her into a hug that smelled like flour and vanilla. Fear is healthy. It keeps us from doing truly stupid things. But letting fear keep you from happiness? That's not healthy. That's just sad. The conversation replayed in Lila's mind through the rest of the afternoon. She helped Nora decorate cookies, wrapped the last of the presents, and tried not to check her phone every 5 minutes to see if Callum had texted about when he'd arrive. He showed up at 7, carrying a bag of gifts and wearing a sweater Nora had given him last week. The sight of him in the cable-knit navy blue, his hair slightly mussed from the cold, his cheeks flushed, it hit Lila with unexpected force. She was in love with him. Completely, terrifyingly, in love with a man she'd married for money and stayed with out of curiosity, and somewhere along the way, had stopped being able to imagine her life without. The realization must have shown on her face because Callum paused in the doorway, concern flickering in his eyes. "You okay?" "Fine, just cold. Come in before you let all the heat out." They decorated the tree together, Lila, Callum, Nora, and Deirdre, hanging ornaments collected over decades. Each one came with a story. The felt reindeer Lila had made in 2nd grade, the crystal snowflake Nora's mother had brought from Ireland, the wooden star Lila's father had carved the last Christmas before he got sick. Callum listened to every story, asked questions, handled each ornament like it was precious. When they finished, he stepped back to admire their work. "It's beautiful." "It's crooked." Lila tilted her head, studying the tree. "The star's definitely off-center." "Perfectly imperfect, then." The words hung in the air, weighted with meaning that had nothing to do with Christmas trees. They went to midnight mass at St. Augustine's, the church filled with candlelight and voices raised in carols that had been sung for centuries. Callum sat between Lila and Nora, holding a hymnal and mouthing words he clearly didn't know. During the prayers, he closed his eyes, and Lila wondered what he was asking for. Back at Nora's house, they exchanged gifts around the tree. Deirdre gave Lila a necklace that had belonged to her mother. Nora gave Callum a framed photograph of their family from Thanksgiving. All of them crowded around the table, laughing at something lost to memory. Callum stared at the photo for a long moment, his throat working. "Thank you. I haven't had a family photo in years." "You have family now." Nora's voice was firm. "Whether that lasts 4 more months or 40 more years is up to you two to figure out." Callum's gift to Lila was small, wrapped in simple brown paper. She opened it carefully to find a key, old, brass, beautifully ornate. "What's this?" "Key to my study, my office. Everywhere I locked you out of." His voice was low, meant just for her. "No more barriers. Not with you." Lila's gift to him felt inadequate by comparison, a first-edition medical text she'd found at a used bookstore, published the year his father died. But when he opened it, his expression transformed into something raw and unguarded. "This was my father's favorite book. He used to read passages to me at bedtime." Callum's fingers traced the worn cover. "How did you know?" "Your mother mentioned it once. I've been looking for months." He looked at her like she'd given him something infinitely more valuable than a book, like she'd given him back a piece of the father he'd lost. They stayed until 2 in the morning, drinking cocoa and eating cookies and talking about nothing and everything. When they finally left, snow was falling again, coating the city in fresh white. In the car, Callum didn't start the engine immediately. He sat with his hands on the steering wheel, staring at the snow accumulating on the windshield. "I meant what I said about renegotiating our arrangement." Lila's heart hammered. "I know." "I need to know if there's any chance you might feel the same way. Because if there's not, I can accept that. But I need to know so I can start preparing for April." This was it. The moment where she could protect herself by lying, by pretending her feelings hadn't shifted into something terrifying and real. Or she could be brave. The way Nora had been brave. The way her grandmother had taught her to be. "There's a chance." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. More than a chance, actually. I've been trying not to feel this way, but somewhere between Sunday dinners and learning your terrible coffee preferences and watching you try to cook breakfast, I stopped being able to imagine life without you. Callum turned to look at her, snow melting on his hair, his eyes reflecting the streetlights. "Say that again." "Which part?" "The part where you can't imagine life without me." "I can't. I've tried. Believe me, I've tried. But you're stuck in my head and my heart, and I don't know how to unstick you." He laughed, the sound surprised and delighted. "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." "It wasn't meant to be romantic. It was meant to be honest." "Same thing sometimes." He reached across the console, cupping her face with one hand. "Can I kiss you? A real kiss, not the pathetic attempt at our wedding." "I thought you'd never ask." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, to change her mind. But Lila met him halfway, her hands finding the soft wool of his sweater, anchoring herself as his lips met hers. The kiss was everything their wedding kiss hadn't been. Warm, real, full of promise and possibility. It tasted like hot chocolate and hope, like taking a chance on something that should have been impossible, but somehow wasn't. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Callum rested his forehead against hers. "So, where does this leave us?" "Honestly, I have no idea. But I'd like to find out." "Me too." They drove home through the snowy streets, holding hands across the console, and Lila felt something settle in her chest. Not certainty, she was too practical for that, but possibility. The chance that something begun in desperation might transform into something chosen. The next morning, Christmas Day, they slept late and made breakfast together. Callum under Lila's careful instruction, both of them laughing when the pancakes came out vaguely circular, but edible. They spent the day in comfortable domesticity, watching movies and avoiding serious conversation, just existing in the same space without the weight of performance or pretense. That evening, Callum's phone rang. Helena, calling with Christmas greetings and thinly veiled questions about how things were progressing. He answered on speaker, and Lila listened to mother and son navigate a conversation that had clearly become easier in recent months. "You sound different." Helena's voice was thoughtful. "Different how?" "Happy. Like you've finally remembered how." After the call ended, Callum pulled Lila onto the couch beside him, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. She settled against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and sure. "Thank you." His voice rumbled against her ear. "For what? For not giving up on me when I was being impossible? For teaching me that walls don't protect you, they just keep you alone. For showing me what family actually looks like." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "For being exactly who you are." Lila tilted her face up to look at him. "You know this is going to be complicated, right? We have 4 months left on our contract, and technically we're supposed to be heading toward divorce. So we renegotiate. Make it real. Turn the temporary arrangement into something permanent." "Just like that?" "Why not? We're already married. We already live together. We already know each other's worst habits and biggest fears. We're just removing the expiration date." "You make it sound simple." "It is simple. I love you." You love me. Everything else is just details. The words hit Lila like a physical force. He'd said it. Actually said it. Not implied or suggested or danced around, just stated it as plainly as a diagnosis. You love me? I thought that was obvious. I've been learning to cook and attending family dinners and tolerating football. What else would make me do those things? Despite everything, Lila laughed. Those are terrible reasons to declare love. Fine, how about this? You're the first person in 20 years who's made me want to be better, who's made me believe I could be better, who's made me remember that being brilliant doesn't matter if you're alone. His hand found hers, threading their fingers together. I love you, Lila Brennan Ashford. I love your stubbornness and your compassion and the way you refuse to let me hide behind walls. I love that you taught me Sunday dinners are sacred and that sometimes the best conversations happen over terrible coffee at 3 a.m. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of that love. Tears streamed down Lila's face. Happy tears, overwhelmed tears. Tears that came from hearing words she'd stopped believing anyone would ever say to her. I love you too. Even though you're arrogant and impossible and you still can't cook to save your life. I'm working on it. I know. That's part of why I love you. They kissed again, slower this time, savoring it. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in white. Inside, two people who'd started as strangers bound by necessity had somehow become something neither of them had expected. A family, a partnership, a chance at forever. The conversation about renegotiating their arrangement would come later. The practical details, the legal adjustments, the announcement to family and friends. But for now, in this moment, they simply held each other and let the future worry about itself. Because sometimes, the best things in life come from the chances we're terrified to take. And sometimes, arranged marriages become the most real thing two people ever build.